Now, one of the most important revealers of this kind of information that I'd like to introduce to you at this time, and to whom this program is definitely dedicated, as are others in this series of Origins and Oracles, is Jordan Maxwell, who spent his whole life researching and uncovering this kind of information so that humanity might again see the true light of reason and might win in this intellectual, spiritual war against the adversaries that seek our ruination. I've often said that if we were to build statues in bronze to Jordan throughout the world, that would only be going a small way to honoring the service to humanity of this remarkable Magi, this true Magi of our times. Those who are familiar with Jordan's work know absolutely that he alone deserves the term the most controversial speaker in the world. One of the most important things that he has brought out in his work is that there are connections, there are occult secrets. There is an occult origin of religion, business, and government. He says in his own words that religion and politics are but two hands serving the same brain. And Jordan Maxwell has been one of the most courageous individuals to show you how the workings of that brain and exactly what plan that brain has for the future. Tony Bushby, in his Secret in the Bible, says that in the 4th century, leading advocates of the Christian church developed a secret worship from which a major portion of the public was excluded, and the custom of communicating only a portion of the community became known as the disciplinae arcanae, or the discipline of the secret. The privacy of these sacred rites performed was guarded with the utmost care from the obtrusive eyes of all who were not qualified to be present. So like Jordan Maxwell has uncovered, like other scholars are researching and finding out, there was a secret tradition within Christianity. And that Christianity itself, I mean, you only have to watch any even Cecil B. DeMille movie coming out of the 50s in America to realize that in relationship to all the other cults and powers and nations, for instance the Romans, Christianity is clearly a conspiratorial organization, a secret organization with a great many mysteries. They had to use symbols to communicate with each other. They were being suppressed. They had to meet in secret, and they were having to disguise their original intentions. And yet today, anyone else who happens to, in our modern age, anybody who else who tends to be like that are considered to be negative or evil. Yet Christianity in its inception was nothing but a secret society. Now, Dr. Lawrence Buck, in Mystic Masonry, he also talks about Christianity's hidden traditions. He says, there was always an exoteric portion given out to the world, to the uninitiated, and an esoteric portion reserved for initiates, that was revealed only in degrees, accordingly as the candidate demonstrated his fitness to receive, conceal, and rightly use the knowledge so imparted. Few professed Christians are aware, perhaps, that such was the case with Christianity during the earliest centuries. And St. Gregory, that's the Bishop of Constantinople in 540 to 604 AD, said, you have heard as much of the mystery as we are allowed to speak openly in the ears of all. The rest will be communicated to you in private, and that you must retain within yourself. Our mysteries are not to be made known to strangers. One of the greatest personalities within the Jewish culture and tradition and religion is Rabbi Moses Maimonides, and he says, every time that you find in our books a tale, the reality of which seems impossible, a story that is repugnant to both reason and common sense, then be sure that the tale contains a profound allegory, veiling a deep, mysterious truth, and the greater the absurdity of the letter, the deeper the wisdom of spirit. Whoever shall find out the true sense of the book of Genesis ought to take care not to divulge it. If a person should discover the true meaning of it by himself, or by the aid of another, then he ought to be silent. For if he speaks, he ought to speak of it only obscurely, in an enigmatical manner, as I do myself. So just know at this stage that if you're a well-meaning Christian who has been following this particular paradigm, understand that there's a hierarchy involved here, and that it's not an egalitarian process, this game of religion. You're being told only what you need to know. From their own words, from the horse's mouth, you have it, that there is an esoteric and an exoteric tradition here. And you may not be privy to that. You may not have earned that right. So be very careful then when you say that what you know here is the whole truth. Because those who are telling you to say that, and those who are giving you this information, they may know something more, something that you don't know. The whole thing is based on mystery. Now what Jordan Maxwell has brought out in his incredible researches and work is the fact that there were in the ancient world not one power structure, but many. And Jordan speaks specifically of the 4 great cults of power. And those are known as the stellar cult, the lunar cult, the solar cult, and the Saturnian cult. And absolutely, fundamentally, no knowledge whatsoever of our times now can be had without an understanding of the role and the origin and the power of these cults. Now, you won't be finding that information in most of the textbooks. There are books from previous centuries that do contain it, but those books and those writers have been sequestered and persecuted. We hope to bring that gnosis to you today, so that you have an insight into where all of this comes from, so you can make sense of all this malarkey. But the cults of power are very, very important. But of course we do find mention of them in other areas, if we know where to look. For instance, in the tarot cards, if you take out the cards of the major arcana, and you look at them in order, you will find that the first 4 cards represent the 4 cults. The most early cult was called the stellar cult, and that is ruled by the first card, the magician, actually showing one of the stellar cult magi. And those who are familiar with the tarot have always wondered at some of the meanings of these incredible symbols. The second card shows the high priestess with her crescent moon, and that relates to the lunar cult. The 5th card, if you go a little bit further on, a few down, you'll find that the Hierophant, or the Pope there, is a reference to the Saturnian cult, the card number 5. And card number 4, the one before that, is a reference to the Emperor, or the solar cult. So we have the creators of the tarot, we have the creators of one of these most powerful divination tools, actually commemorating the cults of antiquity. The first cult was the one that lasted the longest, and some people estimate that it lasted for almost 25,000 years. It's a very ancient cult, and it was known as the stellar cult. As I said, the next one down the line, and of course a lot of these existed contemporaneously, but the next cult of great importance was the lunar cult. And the lunar cult, the females, both in the stellar and the lunar cult, the women, had kept high office. And we'll be talking about that cult a little bit later. Then we have what is known as the Saturnian cult. This is where Judeo-Christianity actually arises. The origins of the whole Jewish philosophy arise out of the Saturnian cult, the worship of the planet Saturn. It's one of the reasons why they worship on Saturn's Day. And the solar cult, which is now in hegemony, and which came out of the ancient world, worship the sun, the solar cult. And we still commemorate that cult by worshipping on the sun day. Again, if we turn to the Bible, we see the connections there. In Revelation 22, Jesus is saying in his own words, I am the root and offspring of David, and the bright and morning star. I'm the bright and morning star. You can't worship it, you can't mention it, you can't practice astrology. That's all meant to be taboo and evil and satanic. But it's okay for Jesus to say, I'm identifying myself with the heavens, with the stars. Everyone knows the morning star is Venus, or the sun. So 3 important things to remember at this stage about Christianity is that it originally was an occult theology, clandestine and suppressed. It was a consolidation of numerous Asian and Oriental pagan doctrines, or what we might want to call cults, in the true sense of the word, not the way it's being used today, that word. And outside of normal fanaticism, most of its founders and adherents had no intention of it becoming any kind of universal religion. Jordan Maxwell, in his Secret Societies and Toxic Religion, gives us a précis of the whole issue of the cults. He says that the leaders of the 7 great cults, of course there was 4 great cults of power, but there was about 7 cults in all, and we'll be dealing with that a little bit later also. 4 great cults, but altogether 7 cults were the origin of the modern theocratic and religious ideas. And he says that the leaders of these 7 great cults of power, that's the 7 churches, decided that rather than fighting amongst themselves for supremacy over the ancient world, that they should combine forces. In fact, each cult feared that they could be deposed if the others conspired in concert against it. This conjunction of cults did not happen immediately or quickly. It took several centuries. The Old Testament contains the story of this coming together. The elite dynasties of these cults operate through their descendants in this world today and are extremely powerful. Alvin Boyd Kuhn refers to this coming together. He says, at the precise time at which Christianity was being formulated, okay, that's about 0 AD, we're told. I mean, we have a very specific date here. At that precise time at which Christianity was being formulated, powerful currents of economic, social, and religious forces had come into play, the operation of which precipitated a swift and drastic shifting of the center of gravity, so to say, in religious values and motivations. And what Jordan Maxwell is talking about is actually accurate. In the same way as any syndicate or any corporation, any merger takes place, it could be through fear. It's not done for the love of humanity, it's done out of saving one's own hide. The idea that if your rivals all gang up together, you'll be out of business. So, indignantly, but out of necessity, you congregate. You create what is known as the first conglomerate in the world. And most interesting, one of the most fascinating anecdotes brought to light is the place of this coming together. The place of the coming together of these great cults, we know today to be Israel. Israel is made up of names that derive connotatively from those cults. Israel literally comes from the words Isis, Ra, and El. And Isis was the moon goddess, Ra the sun, and El was the name of the god of the Saturnian cult, El. So Isis, Ra, and El, and their coming together, was at Israel. It's not that it was so much topographically at a certain place. What we know as Israel, that word, Jacob, the concept of Israel, in all of its permutations, not just a geographical location, represents this movement of coming together of some power cults. So when you say Israel, we need to stop thinking it's just about a certain place or what we've been given. It's the understanding of the coming together of great cults of power in order that they can control the trade routes, in order to be able to control the minds of men. And they thought they could do that a lot better working in concert. Because let it be known that this kind of power that we're under today did not come about overnight. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher and also historian, he said that the Christian church is an encyclopedia of prehistoric cults. Tony Bushby says that the empire, Rome, gradually absorbed and adapted to its own ends the multitude of cults derived from all its parts, and over the ensuing centuries coupled them together as one, the Roman Universal Church. Today it is called the Roman Catholic Church. Henceforth, much of the literature then written was aimed at propagating a fabricated faith to the world and ensuring Roman emperors were given places as heads of church and state. So you can see from that yes, you may come together as cults, but of course one potentate would just love to rule the lot. You may have a coming together of a whole different schools, but any kind of coming together means that one individual would love to be the head, the top dog. And of course they don't mind fighting for that position amongst themselves. Jerry Mander, in his book, 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television, says something very interesting. He says the Hebrews, emerging between 3000 and 2000 BC, won an important political victory by not denouncing what they called the worship of graven images. By destroying the power of the sculptures of the Sumerians and others who preceded them, they effectively destroyed nature-based religion and the veracity of the images. This made possible the substitution of an abstract, single, male, human, all-powerful God. Because it was a sin to create any sculpture of it, it maintained its abstract nature. Although they absorbed God, the Christians somewhat overcame this problem. They created the images of Jesus, a step backwards, or forwards, whatever way you want to look at it, towards paganism. So the Christians later decided, this whole debarring of imagery, of iconography, That's not working. We need to kind of bring that in to some extent. So we have the figure that modeled the image of Jesus. Of course, they didn't bring it in as a truth. They realized you can bring it in, but you can also manipulate that image. So even the image coming down to us out of the Bible of Jesus might also be part of this contrivance. It might not be accurate. In Jeremiah 18, we have what I believe is a passage that refers to this coming together. I believe that the Bible covertly talks about this unification of the cults. Let's just study this passage, for instance, and see if there is a connection, a correspondence. Jeremiah 18 says, "Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he wrought a work on the wheels, and the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hands of the potter, so that he made it again, another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter? Saith the Lord, behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in my hand, O house of Israel. And at what instant I shall speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom to build and to plant it." Now, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, one of the world's finest and most literary beings, writers, and a major occultist, the creator of the Theosophical Society, in her volume, The Secret Doctrine, Volume 3, she says that every scholar must be aware that there are two distinct styles, two schools, so to speak, plainly traceable in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Elohistic and the Jehovistic. The portions belonging to these respectively are so blended together, so completely mixed up by later hands, that often all external characteristics are lost. Yet it is known that the two schools were antagonistic. Tony Bushby says, everything supernatural the presbyters wrote about their developing God could be traced to earlier religious beliefs. And Jordan Maxwell reminds us that there are at least 26 translations of the Bible itself in modern days. One can get an annotated Bible with footnotes featuring 26 different translations of each passage and verse. Today you can go and get it. You can go and get a companion Bible in which each passage can be translated in 26 different ways. Jordan Maxwell says in his presentation, The Dark Side of Jordan Maxwell, he says the authorized version of the Bible was called so because it was the only one that the people were allowed to read. He says it's authorized all right because you better not be caught reading any other one. King James has written it, he's published it, you better read it. It's authorized under pain of death. Now the story of the cults is again featured in the New Testament also, especially in the Nativity. In the Nativity, we hear the story about the birth of Jesus Christ. We find that he's visited by three wise men who bring with them three gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What we have to understand is that this is a propaganda story relating to the cults. Jesus Christ, that is now worshipped on Sun's Day, was the Sun King, the Solar King, that was being worshipped by the three members of the previous cults. He's been born in Bethlehem, but he's visited by three individuals, three kings. This is a story representing the homage being paid to him by the three cults who've been ruling before. And as a point of homage, they bring with them the symbols of the sun: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold is obvious, it's gold, like the sun. But frankincense and myrrh were the incense and the resin that was burned in all the solar temples of the ancient world. The ancients used to love them because they were resinous, and they were golden and amber-like, so much so that they were even referred to as the tears of the sun. So these gifts that were being brought was a tribute to say, we acknowledge that there's a new game in town here. The Solar King is rising, and it's going to be the new paradigm. Now, the mythographers of the four cults decided to pacify each other by dividing the cycle of the year in a manner which would commemorate the deities and theocracies of each cult. Okay, so they're all getting together, but they know that in order to create harmony, they're going to have to make certain allowances. So, since they're all worshippers of the heavens, they're all worshippers of the stars, this is where their great original testament is, they decide to take the annual rotation of the sun and divide it and break it down into a way that would honor and commemorate each of the cults. So the year itself, that's the biggest rotation, was assigned to the solar cult, whose king is the sun. The next division of time, which was the months, just like the word shows you, month, mon, was assigned to the moon to appease the lunar cult and their deity. Then the next division of time was the week. And the week, of course, is made up of 7 days for the 7 planets, because the stellar cult worshipped the planets and the 7 great gods that were the 7 planets. So they get the week. That's why a week isn't just 3 days, 10 days, 15 days, 14 days, 6 days. It's 7 days. Now, each cult would have additional feast days assigned to them, of course, some which would closely coincide, others which were more specific. In fact, the hands of a clock also represent these cults and their division of time. That's right. Not only on a wristwatch do you have the 12 demarcated zones, but you have 3 hands on a clock. The hour hand for Horus, the sun, the min hand for minute, which was the ancient name of the moon, min, and the quick ticking hand, which is either for Mercury, the fastest god, or for the earth, for terrestrial time. The 3 hands of time. I want to emphasize again at this point that there was another little division on a timeline. It's very important to realize that if we create a timeline from, say, 25,000 years BC up until the period of the Ptolemies in Egypt, that's Alexandrian period, the last of the dynasties, what we call Egypt lasted that long. It starts 25,000 years ago and comes up to the time of the invasion of the Greeks. Something incredible must have been happening in that time, because we have to realize that that's a very long, expansive time. In fact, if you take every other age that came later, and I'm talking about the Alexandrian period, I'm talking about the Christian period, or the Grecian period, the Hellenistic period, the Romanesque period, the Renaissance, the Christian period that came then. We move into the neoclassical period, and then we have the modern age. Take it all. Multiply it by 3, and still the period that we know of Egypt was longer. But just for this moment in time, realize that there was another important division between these 4 great cults of power. As I said earlier, the stellar and the lunar cult had women as equals, and often women were the dominant rulers of the clans and the nations, and were in senior positions, mystically, religiously, and also politically. Whereas in the Saturnian and solar cult, and this is a key point to remember, the role of women was substantially diminished. We're going to see a little bit more of that later. Now, the male gods of Egypt and the pharaoh himself were ambassadors of the feminine goddess Numenon. Okay, Numenon just means presence or spiritual energy, something rare and otherworldly. So the male gods, and even the pharaoh himself, were merely ambassadors of that presence. The goddess was called by various names by different cults, of course. But Hermes, Thoth, Anubis, Horus, they were all agents of balance and justice. And that was a principle known as Mayat, always symbolized by a feather or by the great scales of justice. The Egyptian historian and revisionist Mustafa Gadala, in his masterpiece Historical Deception, says that the Egyptian women were entrusted with the civilization. The woman, or princess, and not the male, was the legal heir to the throne, and the man she chose to marry would become the ruling pharaoh. Again, I want to point out that the word pharaoh means pharos nous. It comes from 2 Greek words. There's many, many meanings of this word, but it originated from the Greek pharos, meaning fire, and nous, meaning intelligence or mind. So it means fiery mind or enlightened mind, mind on fire. These were semi-enlightened or fully enlightened beings that were ruling their states. Unlike the stellar and lunar cults, which were ecocentric, egalitarian, and inclusive, the solar and Saturnian cults were anthrocentric, hierarchical, and exclusive. Due to their rescripting of the cosmological canon, the omnipresent goddess was made subservient to the all-powerful male god. The goddess figure was relegated to the role of consort or emanation. In many cases, the goddess was denigrated entirely into the temptress, the femme fatale, la belle dans sans mercé, as they say in French, the seducer and waylayer of the male heroes. I mean, it goes to such an extreme that we have in the Bible that Adam is the father of all mankind. Eve, the female, if we can get our minds around this concept, of course, which is saying something, but the idea is that Eve comes from the male, Adam, not the other way around. So twisted and convoluted this story is. Well, then, equally radical must be the act of revision. Equally dramatic and courageous must we be in order to countermand this level of debauchery of an old and ancient and sacred canon. The master magician from the Victorian era, Aleister Crowley, in his book Liber 777, says that for some reason best known to themselves, the translators of the Bible have carefully crowded out of existence and smothered up every reference to the fact that deity is both masculine and feminine. They have translated the feminine plural by masculine singular in the case of the word Elohim. That's right, the word God originally, Elohim, one of the earliest names for God, was plural. It meant both male and female in Hebrew. But that's all right. We can flaunt that rule as well. You bring in a new game and that one can be destroyed also. Now this changeover, this paradigm shift from the stellar to the solar has more meaning and significance than just a mere historical anecdote. It also has consequences for the psychology of human beings. We don't have time to elaborate in detail, but certain scholars are discovering that this movement, this changeover from the ecocentric, matrifocal paradigm into the anthrocentric one, the hegemonic one, changed the way human beings thought. Literally, we moved from a right brain type of cognition into a left brain mode of cognition. We became more rational. We became more aggressive and acquisitive in our thinking. We started to think of ourselves as being separate from nature. It had a schizoid effect on our own consciousness. This also needs to be taken into consideration in this study. Eric Newman, in his book on the moon and matriarchal consciousness, says, the comparative passivity of matriarchal consciousness is not due to any incapacity for action, but rather to an awareness of subjection to a process in which it can do nothing, but can only let happen. It is an inner possession, realized and assimilated by the personality, but not easily discussed, for the inner experience behind it is scarcely capable of adequate verbal expression. For this reason, a plain and simple masculine consciousness finds the knowledge of matriarchal consciousness unverifiable, willful, and par excellence mystic. It isn't mystic. It's very practical. It's the most practical thing on earth. But to the viewing objective mind, that which appears to be passive, that which appears to be rooted in the being as opposed to the doing, is considered incomprehensible. Because this whole acquisitive mind think, this new way of approaching life and approaching reality as being separate from the natural order, cannot understand the feminine approach. If you suppress the feminine in yourself, you leave yourself open to being controlled. As D. Hollander, in his book Tarot for Beginners, writes, the high priestess uses her wisdom and understanding to enable others to find their own true path. The high priest uses his power to increase his authority over others. So there you have it in a nutshell. And that pretty much also sums up the whole Gnostic idea. The Gnostics did not convert sinners. They awoken the ready. When you're ready, you'll awaken, and it's perfectly natural. There was no idea that you were some sinner, that after you had matriculated, then you'd be ready to be converted. This carried no currency whatsoever in the ancient world, and the Gnostics, who are even surviving today, always let you know that man is his own priest, his own priestess, and of course he doesn't need an outward authority. But the Yahwistic side, the Solar Cult and Saturnian cults, had a very different agenda. In Isaiah 1, we read God saying, bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with them. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hateth. They are trouble unto me. I am weary to bear them. Come now and let us reason together, saith the Lord. Perhaps one of the greatest scholars that mankind has ever played host to was the Egyptologist from Scotland, Gerald Massey. In his volumes on the subject of astrotheology and the origin of all religions, he says, the retouching by the Greeks, like that of the Semites, tended to efface the figures or falsify the meaning of the mythos, and the astronomical facts are of 1,000-fold more important than all the petty embellishments of irresponsible fancy. Perhaps the worst perversion of the true mythos made by the Greeks was their treatment of the polar dragon. Now that's a loaded statement and it means an awful lot. But right now just let us remember that the stellar cult and the lunar cult had as one of their great symbols the dragon or the serpent. And that one of the reasons why later animals and creatures became demonic was also part of this process of conversion. Now, we said that there were 7 cults, 4 that were very powerful, but that leaves at least 3 other ones. We don't have time to touch on all the cults and their history. We can only give an overview. But in brief, the other cults were the volcano cult, or cult of fire. It's a very important cult of the ancient world. When you're studying the ancient mysteries, especially coming out of Africa and the Far East, you're going to see great reverence to Vulcan, to Hephaestus, to the fire god and the cult of the mountain on which this fire god is meant to be enthroned and worshipped from. And then we have a cult known as loosely as the mushroom cult. More specifically, it's the cult of Dionysus. And then we have the cult of Venus, which involved the cult of ecstasy. One of the most important of the other cults, and researchers are often led to believe, rightly so, that this cult is extremely powerful in the ancient world, was the cult of Dionysus, or that the Greeks called Dionysus. Then we have the mushroom cult, and the story of the mushroom cult was brought out by one of the translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls, who actually met his death, possibly because of what he found out. The great Christian scholar, translator, and antiquarian John Allegro. He discovered that there was much mention in the ancient Dead Sea Scrolls of this mushroom cult and its significance in the world. He discovered that little traditions that we have, like wearing the little beret on our heads as a hat, comes from the time of the mushroom cult. And even the fact that in the ancient world turbans are worn, and lots of different hats are to commemorate this very, very powerful religious theocracy of the ancient world. And now there's a few books on this subject. But even the fact that churches have these strange domes on the top comes from a specific time and the worship of the mushroom. And of course, where there's mushrooms, there's herbs. And where there's herbs, there's herbology. And the whole study of healing and homeopathy and what have you, in a positive and also in a negative way. And it might come as a shock to most of you to realize that the modern day pharmaceutical monopolies actually originate out of this cult of the mushroom. This mushroom cult and its understanding of pharmacology and mind-altering drugs, as Jordan Maxwell and others have brought out, a lot of the pharmaceutical mendicants of the modern world, as by their symbolism they will betray to you, come out of this very powerful cult. Now the cult of Dionysus are in fact, or the descendants of this cult of Dionysus, are the main controllers of the modern media and of the modern rock and roll business and the music business in general. So let me be clear about what I'm saying here. The music business, especially the rock and roll business, and a lot of the media, that's the magazine design, the great media conglomerates of the world, the television companies, and also the film companies, they're a hierarchy. They're organized in a hierarchical way, and they're controlled at the top by an elite group who are bloodline linked to a very ancient and powerful cult. Once we understand this and begin studying this particular concept, we will understand what we're seeing when we watch a lot of the symbolism and the imagery and the corporate logos that these individuals use. It's not by chance that they use what they do. If you've seen the program in this series, The Subversive Use of Sacred Symbolism, you'll know what I mean by all of this. Now, Dionysus and the cult of Dionysus are expert at being able to choose and put before us certain icons who embody, whether they realize it or not, the powers of the god of Dionysus. This cult is very adept at being able to select certain individuals who personify and allow us to worship them in the same way. And those individuals will help us awaken certain chakras. Those individuals will personify excessiveness and sexual licentiousness and liberation. And we will follow them. And this is an old cult, going back to Roman times and even before. In the case of Elvis Presley, for instance, if we study his date of birth astrologically, and even if you want more proof, just go to some of the autobiographies and biographies, the biographies that are on the king of rock and roll, the Solar King. You will find out just how much control from secret societies was being used in this man's life, unbeknownst to him. But he's certainly not the only example. And unfortunately also what we have to understand is that the cult of Dionysus are wont to sacrifice their solar king. Sacrifice is a very important aspect to all rituals and all ancient religions. All religions of the ancient world, including the Christian, involve the principle of sacrifice. The sun rises in the morning from the horizon, rises to its peak, and then descends into the underworld where it has to face the shadows that it inherited while it was blazing. The stronger a light shines, the deeper and darker the shadow that it casts. And in this great cycle is understood by these cults. The sun must go into the underworld in order to face its own demons and to traverse the underworld. These are all occult principles. And therefore, that also means that the Sun King might be sacrificed. And if we study the dates of a lot of assassinations in this world and get into that whole theory, we're going to find an incredible story unfolding there. It's very important for us to be able to decode some of the symbolism that certain bands, certain groups, and certain media cartels are using. This is a whole subject in itself, and of course we go into that in a different program. But safe it is to say that there's an origin to the symbolism and to the words and the titles and the meanings. And the cult of Dionysus, who are behind the World Psychedelic Institute. Now, the World Psychedelic Institute, in point of fact, was created in London in 1965 by Michael Hollingshead, who was also an associate of Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley. One might be interested to read The Saucer Full of Secrets, which is the biography of the band Pink Floyd and how that band had to resist this kind of takeover, but that they were approached, and a lot of these bands are sequestered or approached after the point of their creation, or some bands and some figures within the musical business are promoted from day one. They literally are bloodline created to the unofficial families of these cults. And they're put out on the world stage for a reason. Many of the pop icons are born to elites, but are raised in unofficial families, and then when the time is right, they are put before the world via the media. And we're given the rags to riches girl or boy next door story. However, they may have blood ties to royal dynasties. Some know this, and some do not. So some of the people who may be bloodline connected to these royal dynasties or these old ancient cults may not be aware of it. Some are privy to it, others may not be privy to it. Depends on the individual. And I'm not saying that every single figure out there is a member of this cult. It's, of course, a whole issue. It's quite problematic to be able to discern. It's a study, like any other study. One must decode. And in order to decode it, you must have familiarity with these cults and how they work. You must know what their code words are, their catchphrases, their symbols. They will tell you who they are, but you have to be able to decode the symbolism. Why is it that Madonna's first video was made in Venice? Why are so many videos and films set in Venice? Why does she wear the crucifix? What do some of the lyrics mean? One of the other important cults was the cult of Venus. The ancient cults worship Venus a lot. The names of the place Venice and Vienna, certain cities of the world are actually named after Venus. On the prow of the old navigator ships in the ancient world, the great navigators of the high seas used to have the Stella Maris, or the ladies, the head, the prow. They would have the figure of the female, because navigators worshipped the stars and thought of Venus as their guiding star. And ships were always referred to as her or she. And they're shaped in the form of the Vesica Pisces, which relates to the female. And they float on the waters, which also represent the female. There's a lot of symbolism involved in shipping and navigation. And the tutelary deity that all seamen of the ancient world worshipped was the star Venus. And there's a cult of Venus operating in the world. The James Bond films, for instance, as I was mentioning in Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, the 007s go back to the Tudor dynasty. It's not just a work of fiction here. In fact, in the James Bond movies, one of the most important motifs in that is the use of code words like M and Q. And you'll notice that when the protagonist, the James Bond figure, comes in to get his orders, he very specifically comes from a hall into a small chamber where the female sits behind the desk, and then from that small chamber he goes into another larger chamber through a secret door or passage that leads to a bigger chamber with a male sitting behind the door. This replicates the interior of the Great Pyramid. And the pyramid, of course, is very sacred to Freemasons and Illuminati. There's a message in these films, secret codes that are being given to us to replicate something from the ancient world that we are not educated to be able to see. But there's a method involved in that, in those series of movies and in many, many others. A lot of the pornographic magazines contain symbolism that shows their origins, relating back to the cult of Venus and this incredible favoritism towards the blonde, down from the earliest times of Hollywood right up to the present day, the cult of the blonde. And of course, those who've done their homework in this fascinating subject understand that the cult of Venus and the cult of Dionysus are involved in not only the dissemination of pornography, but also involved very heavily in white slave trafficking and opium dealing and satanic ritual abuse and child prostitution and what have you. This is slowly coming to light, but this is an old story going back many thousands of years. It's also very important to realize that none of this is covert. These individuals will always put the symbols in front of you if you know how to track it. Even certain movies are made to reveal the agenda and to let you know who's making what and who's doing what. Movies like The Eye of the Devil and The Green Door and Eyes Wide Shut and many, many other movies from different genres contain motifs that, if you know how to decode them, are very significant. And the patron, these individuals that we're talking about, a lot of these cults, are also patronized. They have to have finances. They have to have an agenda. And one of the most powerful dynasties that make up these cults and also patronize these cults are what we know as the Venetians, coming out of Italy. The Venetians were originally the Phoenicians, the worshippers of Venus. And in Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, we show the ancestry of the Phoenicians and how they go back to pre-Diluvian times, even to the time of Atlantis, and the high cultures of the ancient world. But the Phoenicians becomes the Venetians of Italy, the Longhi and the Guelphs and other very wealthy families, their descendants are still occupying the world today. But of course the Venetians, after their conflict with the powers of the Roman Catholic Church, made a move from Venice and settled in Holland and eventually came to England. Upon their move to Holland, the Black Venetians, and this is the name that they go by, the Black Venetians created the Great Amsterdam Bank, the financial hinge of the 17th century, and they created the Dutch East India Company. They also controlled the finances of many royal dynasties like the Stuarts. They are actually the promoters of Martin Luther, of Protestantism, Puritanism, the Jesuits, the Club of Rome, the later Freemasons, and most secret societies. Through the House of Hanover, that's the House of Orange, they came to England and have been dominating there. They've been the dominating power since William III of Orange. This is William III of Orange, known in Ireland as King Billy, the destroyer of the Stuart dynasties. And after him came George Ludwig I, all of the House of Hanover. But the House of Hanover originates from the Venetian line, through the Habsburgs, through the Hohenzollerns, all the way back to Venice and beyond. Queen Victoria, in her time, was the head of the Black Guelphs, called black because their deeds were so black. literally the queen, the empress of the world. And the Windsor family of today, the modern royals ruling out of England, the Windsors is a name concocted for them today primarily because King George, the father of the Queen of England, couldn't barely speak a word of English. And yet here they are declaring war on Germany, and they're a German family reigning from London. So as part of the propaganda, the name Windsor was concocted for them. But just realize that their actual names are Saxe-Coburg, Battenberg, later changed to Mountbatten, Bourse-Lyon, and Guelph, with Guelph being the most important name. If you're into studying this, please note the name Guelph, G-U-E-L-P-H. That's the connection back to Venice. There's two great students of this, along with Jordan Maxwell. One is the statesman from America, Lyndon LaRouche, who's done some fine work on this in his book, Dope Incorporated. This is the book that put him 2 years in the federal stockade for what he knew. And also the works of Dr. John Coleman, who wrote The Committee of 300, and Diplomacy by Deception, and also One World Order. Dr. John Coleman, an insider who reveals the origin of these cults. If we go back to the symbolism of the stellar cult, we find that these were the original magi, the original architects, the original astrologers, the original navigators. In my work on this subject, I have pointed out many times that these are the originators of the high geometry, all of the great buildings, monuments, temple structures of the world. They're also the creators of our divination arts, principally, and also a lot of the folk tales and fairy stories, and also the idea of teaching great mysteries in the way of a parable or an allegory is also part of their legacy. There are those who watch their flocks by night. In the Bible, we hear that term, watching the flocks by night. Well, the shepherds who watch their flocks by night are nothing but the magi, astrologers who watch their flocks by night, the heavenly flocks, the stars. In the tarot, as I said, the first card of the tarot, which shows a magician, is a throwback to the stellar cult. That little symbol that you see above the head of the magician and that you also see in card number 8 represents the zodiac. It's called the lemniscate. In Celtic tradition, one of the earliest poets of Ireland, the precursor to Merlin, was called Abergahain, or in English you pronounce it Amergin. And he says, "Who but I knows the ages of the moon, the resting place of the sun?" Again, clearly demonstrating that they were stellar cult. Now the primary symbol of the stellar cult, as I said a little earlier, was the serpent, which you see being worn by the pharaohs. It's often called the uraeus or the agathodaimon. Agathodaimon just meaning the winged serpent or the guardian angel. This is where we get the word Holy Spirit from, agathodaimon or agathodaimon. And of course, the ancient antagonism in the Christian hegemony of the evil serpent, and that the solar king has to come out and defeat the dragon or the serpent. I mean, where did these motifs come from? We ever stop and think, what on earth is that all about, and where did that symbol come from? And of the many symbols and motifs that you can have, what is this whole thing about having to slay a dragon? Well, it's propaganda again. It's pulpit propaganda. One cult supplanting another. One cult taking the power from another cult, appropriating the wisdom and the technologies and the methodologies of a previous cult. We have the old rivalries between, even in Egypt, in the latter days of Egypt, the old stellar king Set becomes the antagonist of the later sun god Horus. In order to show you the conflict, they say that they're twins. They're all born in the same family, but they're antagonists. We have to read between the lines and see what's being said here. In Irish mythology, we hear about St. Patrick going up to the high mountain and then coming down and saying, "Behold, I've cast out the serpents from the land." And of course the reference here, as we clearly demonstrated in Atlantis, alien visitation and genetic manipulation, is again that the serpents is not a physical snakes. This is another piece of propaganda. St. Patrick represents the solar cult, who's coming to take over, and the serpents being the previous Celtic races there, who worship the stars and the earth and the waters. They are now history. They're being suppressed, so they're being cast out. The serpent race is being cast out. But we have mentioned in the Bible to the serpents and the wisdom of the serpents when Jesus remonstrates with his own disciples and says, be ye as wise as serpents. Yes, that's right. Be ye as wise as the serpents. What serpents? Well, he's referring to the fact that if only you were as wise as those great astrologers, navigators, and geomancers of old, the serpent race. If only you 12 were as wise as they, then I'd be happy. Because the Christ is aware of the power and wisdom of the stellar cult, the original Magi. In Celtic Ireland we have tremendous emphasis on the serpent motif, even in Christian era. On many flags we still see the dragon of the stellar cult being commemorated. They're all throwbacks. In Tara, the very capital city, Tara, in Gaelic means, it comes from the word Drumcain, meaning the hill of the serpents, because the kings were serpent race and they sat on the hill of the serpents. We find that there's a Judaic tribe called the Nashon, for which King David was a member. But we find that this word means serpent. The word Nashon means serpent. And that's where we get the modern word nation. N-A-T-I-O-N means serpent. So we'll just remember that when you hear people talking about the great nation states. Understand that that is a word that has a very ancient history. Thousands of years old, going back to the original Nashons. From the earliest days of Acadia and Sumeria and Babylon, we see the serpent and the serpent gods. In Egypt, the winged serpents. In Greece, we find that Pythagoras, the keeper of the mysteries, one of the wisest men of all times. The word Pythagoras means I am the python. I am the python. I am the serpent. And H.P. Blavatsky says in her Isis Unveiled, she says, Pythagoras never allowed his neophytes to see him during the years of probation, but instructed them from behind a curtain in his cave. We have a Scottish regiment known as the Dragoons. We have the Dragon Court of the Plantagenets. These fine standing stones and the ancient megaliths are known colloquially and locally as the dragon's teeth, because it was understood by the locals that they were built by the serpent cult. In the United States, at the Ohio Mound, it betrays the same illusion that the ancients were a stellar cult who worshipped the constellations and who are responsible for the great earthworks. The Avebury serpent, practically 8 miles long. In Christianity, we often hear about the cherubim and the seraphim. But what we don't hear about is the meaning of those two words. If you decode and go back to an old concordance and look up the words seraphim and cherubim, it will mean fiery serpent or blazing serpent. So the angels are serpents. And many words again. In etymology, a fascinating subject. We find that the earliest name for the serpent was Cain, or Canaan. So, the land of Canaan, that's right, the land of the Akkadians, the land where it all began, the Holy Land is known before the Hebrews get there as the land of Canaan, the Canaanites who were murdered and suppressed. The evil ones who worshipped idols. No, just the serpent cult whose time is to be murdered and massacred now because the solar cult has arrived, or the Saturnian cult is in town. And the word Cohen, ask any Jewish person what the word Cohen means, and they will tell you that it means serpent priest. The word Cain or the word Khan, like in James Khan. In the Far East we have Chan, but Chan means serpent. In the Middle East we have Khan, K-H-A-N, like we would say Mr. It's a title for a male, Khan. The word Khan refers to the serpent. In Ireland you have the boy's name, Kieran. You have the female or the girl's name, Karen. And Karn, the word for death, but actually really means the serpent. So in Egypt, every time you see a god with the stars about their head or with a headdress of stars, just realize what is being mentioned here. This is a member of the stellar cult. They're implying that there is a cult of power and gods to be worshipped. We don't have to look very far for this motif. The Statue of Liberty is a stellar cult icon that goes back to Sechet, the old Egyptian goddess. It was just shown exactly like that, with star in her 7 rays in her crown. The subject of astrology comes down to us from the stellar cult. They are the ones who brought us the study of astronomy and astrology. They understood that the sun rose at the vernal equinox, rose to its highest position at the summer solstice, and then fell into winter at the autumn equinox. And that particular arch was revered, and it was called the Northern Arch. And to commemorate it, and because the stellar cult were great builders, they would build arches in all the cities of the world. And still today, when we build an arch or we create an arch, that comes from the commemoration of an astrological motif, the Northern Arch, the sun passing over the zodiac. And that's why in the middle of arches you have the keystone, which usually has a date on it, because the date is to do with zodiacal degrees that the sun passes through. And the stellar cult's main deity, or one of the earliest deities, was Nuth, the heavenly mother, the goddess of the night sky, the primordial Madonna. They were fixated on this idea of the earth being the terrestrial father, the red king that you see in chess, but the stellar mother, or white queen. You have Guinevere and you have Arthur. Guinevere literally means white queen. That's all it means, and it's a reference to Isis. But Isis is a reference to the moon, the white queen up there in the heavens. And the red king is, guess who? The sun. So thrones were put beside each other, red and white, male and female, Leo and Cancer. They were fixated on the idea of bringing heaven to earth. They didn't see a separation between the terrestrial and the celestial. And so when they would build their monuments, their castles, their temples, their universities, their cities, it was absolutely fundamental that none of that building could ever begin without honoring the stars and then even encoding into these structures symbols of the stars, which is why if you go to the Arc of Triumph or you go to most of the universities of the world and study them, actually look at the walls and the stained glass windows and the floors and the mosaics of even quite modern buildings, and not to mention the city layouts, you will see stars and emblems of the heavens. This is an old practice. We know from just looking and studying the ancients that they were fascinated with the stars and the heavens. They were fascinated with geometry, the measurement of the earth and the measurement of the stars. In fact, the word geometry means that, the measurement of the goddess Gaia, or the earth. So they understood that in order to honor their gods, they should pay attention to them, that there was movements in the heavens, that there was mathematical forms of communication, and that you weren't a proper disciple of your God unless you paid attention to the nuances and subtleties that were happening around you in the heavens. This is where astrology was born. Demeter, the Greek god, literally means the same thing, the earth, measuring the earth. We get words like matter and matrix and mother and mathematics and marriage and mate, all coming out of the word Maat, which was the most ancient of the goddesses, the goddess of balance and the goddess of measurement of the Egyptians. As I said, Freemasons and secret societies keep these mysteries. The very Freemasonic symbol is a mere simulacra. The symbol of the compass and the rule is a geometric version of the Egyptian Nuth and Jeb, the earth god Jeb, copulating, merging with the sky goddess Nuth. Freemasonry originates from the stellar cult. They are the present keepers of the mysteries of the stellar cult. The stellar cult's philosophy can be summed up very simply. No difference between psychic energy and physical energy. Incomprehensible. Yes, they knew what two was. If you put down two stones, they'd understand there's two things there. But they had no understanding of what we know as duality. There was no word for duality. There was only one thing to be studied. There was no separation between macrocosm and microcosm. Everything was unified. Everything was a holarchy. They tried to show this in the way they lived. They tried to commemorate this in the building of Stonehenge and in the villages that were circular. And of course, we all know about the intense and detailed geometry that went into some of these monuments and Cyclopean ruins. That's a whole study in itself. But even again in modern context, cities are based on the zodiac. Here's the center of Paris with 12 radiating streets. And Paris is not the only example. Though we may have the solar cult attempting it at later stages, the solar cult in their buildings are borrowing or appropriating the geometrical standards and skills of an earlier cult. Yes, we do have those skills today, but where did they come from? The 7 wonders of the world and many more wonders besides originate in a certain cult of ancient times, not just centered in Egypt. Every culture, including even the Viking and the Celtic and the Maya, and even in Africa, you have stellar representatives of the stellar cult. When we hear the simple term city hall, do we realize that that comes from somewhere? The word city comes from cetus, which is the word in Latin for the female vagina, or the female opening. And the word hall is a derivation of the Latin phallus, which is the male member, the phallic. So city hall literally is, again, the coming together of the male and the female. Remember, we were talking about terrestrial and celestial. These cities were made like a circle, and then you would have a obelisk in the center, or a fountain in the center, or a clock tower, in order to transmit terrestrial events and symbolism to earth. And then the city hall, which was the center of all civic society, would be called the cetus and the hall, the phallic and the male and the female coming together. City hall. Jerusalem lies at the center of all medieval maps. The most sacred place is this most holy city, and was the supposed site of Jesus' own burial, the church of the Holy Sepulchre. So again, all holy places, whether they're of the ancient world or the new one, embody certain motifs. And I have to emphasize that this is not something of the ancient past. Cities of the modern world are done this way. In Ireland we have the oldest temple site in the world, so thousands of years before the pyramid. We have a place in Ireland called Brooke-na-Boyne, or in English it's New Grange, and it sits on the river known as the Boan. That's why it's called the Brooke-na-Boyne. Boan was the cow goddess, and the river Boan was her river. So there's the whole idea of the female again, that near the river is this most ancient of tombs. But what's remarkable about this tomb is its geometry. It was built and fashioned by the stellar cult. It's a complete enigma. It was built without cement. And what's more astounding is that on the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of December, that's the winter solstice, the sun rises on the horizon, and then like something out of Indiana Jones, literally creeps across and touches a very small window in New Grange. Above the door of this immense tomb is a little portal, a window, 7 feet high, and the sun, a beam of light, will pass into this window and then go into the inner chamber and fall on the back wall. Many American scholars like Arthur C. Clarke have gone and looked at this and checked this out. And even though the heavens have shifted in many thousands of years, this event still takes place mysteriously. They can't understand how this building was designed. The light pierces the inner chamber on those 3 days, and on the same night, of the solstice nights, the moonlight will do exactly the same thing. And this is not the only example of this. There are many tombs in Ireland and in Celtic countries where this anomaly takes place. Or they might do it in a different way. You might have the phallic tower, representing the male phallic, on the mound or the hill. Let's not forget we have in Christianity the Mount of Olives. We have the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, we've got the male sun god, the phallic, ithyphallic male, standing there giving a sermon. But let's not forget where he's doing it. Don't we understand there's paganism involved here? That he's not doing it sermon in the throne, he's not sermon in the city center, sermon at the top of a castle turret, sermon on a horseback. It's sermon on the mount. Another feature that harkens back to the stellar cult specifically is the idea that the interior of churches have the dome. The celestial dome, or the domos, representing the night sky and the heavens. But again, the idea that not just in city centers, but different parts of the famous cities, we always have the clock tower. Now this clock dial is usually so far up in the sky that you can't even see it to tell what time it is, so it's an architectural motif alone. And that is to represent the same idea we've been talking about. And that's why the spires are like this. They're shaped like that, because it's transmitting celestial energy down to the terrestrial. Because the ancient creators of cities understood this, that there's a symbiosis between the heavenly and the earth. Just as in a human being's life, his fate is connected to some zodiac out there, so the whole of the fate of mankind, the fate of those who live on earth and the communities of the world also is written in the heavens. We see these architectural masterpieces, and we know subconsciously, we're attracted to it, we know it's beautiful, but we have consciously forgot why. And as I said, this is again to be understood as not something of remote history. This is something of the modern age today. David Oveson, an American writer, in his book The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital, has discovered that in Washington, D.C., for instance, there are 23 complete zodiacs in Washington, in the architecture, secreted into the architecture there. And there's over 1,000 other zodiacal and planetary symbols. And there's 4 zodiacs in London. London is also divided into 28 boroughs, representing the lunations of the moon. There's not a single building in England of any importance that's not built over some Celtic site of the previous stellar and lunar cult. Those who've studied this subject know that. But Oveson and other researchers are now discovering that the secret societies like the Freemasons, for whatever purposes, have designed the cities meticulously to not only align with certain constellations, but to commemorate certain stars like the star Sirius, and Draco, and Alpha Draconis, and the Pole Star, and the Bear, Ursa Major, so on. However, we've got to realize that there was mistakes were also made in this transposition. Cyril Fagan, in his book Astrological Origins, says that in their desire to appear highly intellectual, scientific, and mathematical, the Greeks, probably about the time of Alexander the Great, adopted the solar nomenclature, thereby turning ancient zodiacal symbolism topsy-turvy and making it sheer nonsense. This must be borne in mind very deeply, that when we're even researching and studying this subject, and when we come upon things that don't quite make sense, this can help you to realize that, yes, you're studying this here, but we have the Greeks and the Romans and the medieval period, we've got the Christians, and all of these individuals take the ancient gnosis, but they twist it and contort it and subvert it. And therefore it's a process. This is what this program is dedicated to, is trying to help you in this decoding process, so that you may get back to the original theology. Theology is very important for our lives. Mythology is very important for our lives. Spirituality is. But not the one that's been handed down to us, sanitized and homogenized and corrupted and subverted. This package that we just buy and install. There's a much more ancient one. And we need to get back to that as we come full circle.